Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We'll be talking about groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today, I'm joined by the most brilliant Lottie Unwin. Lottie, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I just had a little moment when you did that intro. We can come on to talk about it, but I think I've always wanted to be someone that had an impact on work culture. And hearing you introduce me like that was just like a little fist bump of like, maybe I did it.
You're one of the power shakers.
Well, I mean, shake in a tiny, tiny, tiny way, but it was definitely like something I set out to do earlier in my career. So the very fact that I've made it onto this lineup is a little moment for me.
Now, Lottie, you've been around the block in your career and you've enjoyed some top marketing roles, brand strategy roles, particularly around the startup conversation and the startup space. And then came Upworld, which, if I've understood the story correctly, was this kind of way of you expressing and supporting startup marketers because you yourself had experienced the isolation and loneliness that can come with those kind of roles. And that's something that you and I share. I've worked in startup marketing myself, and it can be a real Wild West, a lot of pressure, a lot of unknowns, people around you who aren't really sure how to measure things or what they're really looking for. You're kind of just having to try a lot of stuff out, and it can be a really scary place to be, and it can be really, really lonely. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind just talking us through the Upworld story, how that came to be, and why you decided to build this solution for people who are in your situation.
The story kind of starts on my first day at Procter & Gamble. So I'd graduated from university. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought that marketing was kind of interesting, and I had this great grad job at Procter & Gamble, but I thought I was going to hate big business. But I turned up sort of like in my suit to the big corporate office in Weybridge and realised that I loved marketing and I loved personal development. Like, I'd done a degree in English literature, which I'd, to be honest, found really hard, didn't really understand the point of poetry, had found learning really challenging. I kind of written myself off academically and then turned up in the workplace and thought like, no, actually this training is amazing and I love marketing and I love the psychology behind it and I found a thing that I'm really fascinated in. I left Procter & Gamble to go and work in a startup because I was bouncing off the walls and I was way too high energy for a corporate. But I found that transition from corporate to startup really grueling. So on the one hand, great, I was in this high energy environment. I sort of knew I'd found my home. On the other hand, I had no training, I had no support, I had no network. So the days back in big business where if I was stuck, I'd like wander across the floor and find the version of me on the other brand, that didn't exist anymore. I was the only one doing marketing in my startup. And I just found that miserable. I felt it really demotivating. I felt that the kind of notion that you're meant to find all your own answers was a bit ridiculous. And it crashed my sense of identity. So I went from feeling pretty kind of pleased with myself and like I knew what I was up to and I was sort of like proud of who I was showing up in the world to being quite profoundly lost. If I felt like I was bad at work, I felt like everything was falling apart. I also at that point had a couple of different references for what I thought the workplace was asking from me. So I had big business where the female leaders particularly were like weird, Botoxed ice queens who never showed any emotion, and I didn't really feel like were very kind of meaningfully present. Like they really showed up as the woman in a suit and not who they were. And then the female leaders I had in startups who again felt like they were really struggling with authenticity, and it felt quite culty and dishonest, and like there was a real lack of visibility. That's the negative stuff. A huge amount of wonderful things I can say about those women, but a lot of stuff that I was finding quite difficult. And I felt like I wasn't really finding my space. So I started a supper club to get to know other heads of marketing, to stop me feeling so lonely and make me better at my job. That was about 10 years ago now. Turns out a lot of people were really lonely. A lot of people needed a support network to feel like they could kind of handle their day jobs. And that grew and grew. And so that's Upworld in a nutshell. It's that supper club on speed. So there's now 1,200 paying members and 8,000 people in our audience. And we host events all the time, and we have a separate sub-community for marketing directors, and we have a recruitment business, and I now have another business called Brand Hackers where we run outsourced marketing teams for brands with big dreams. So loads of stuff going on all in this kind of startup marketing space. But it really came from me trying to be less lonely, trying to make myself better. And then a lot of the culture and the ethos behind it has been about how you create an authentic, safe space at work, and how you just change the narrative that work doesn't need to be lonely, and work, like all kind of professionalism with a capital P, I think is a bit useless. And so that's where we're at today. And I think a marketing community is very much just like the vehicle through which I'm trying to do something that is like a little bit bigger and a little bit more important around work, like the workplace as a whole. And so for me, it's just like the way in which I do that.
You know, what I love about this story is that the first step was simply just to respond to that deeply held human need for connection.
Yeah.
To have people around you that understand what you're going through and be able to share stories, right? And what you started was simply responding to that need, which then leads the way into these kind of broader expressions. And I guess as you've kind of gone on that journey, it's become a little bit clearer with each step about, okay, so what's the big mission here? What's the big stuff that we're trying to get done? But it starts with that, can I just meet someone's need? Like, can I just get alongside somebody? Can I invite people to come alongside me? And it's created this great unfolding story of Upworld. And what's the other one you just mentioned? Brand
Hackers.
And Brand Hackers as well. And so I just love that, how it's kind of organically come to life. Now, you know, you are a startup founder, you are running a business, and people are following you and following your lead. And I'm just wondering about, as you've kind of gone on that journey, what's been some of the big surprises on that road? And what are some of the challenges that have cropped up along the way that perhaps you weren't expecting?
Well, it's been a very surprising journey. I always knew I wanted to build a business. Like, if you asked me as a 7-year-old what I wanted to do when I grew up, I used to say to my mum, I wanted to be a property magnate, which is like the most middle class thing I've ever heard. But I think I always had this view that I wanted to build and make and like take territories. It's kind of like, it's like a land grab ethos. And when I had a school project, you know, if the brief was like, make a poster for a school, I would write the curriculum and design the floor plans and spend all weekend making models of stuff. You know, I made worlds, and that was how I played. And so I've always been a builder, and I kind of knew that I wanted to run a business, but I never knew what that was going to be. This was never meant to be the business. I moved to India, having been running supper clubs in the UK for a long time, and was sort of like at my kitchen table in Delhi with no job and with my ex-boyfriend who was kind of paying for everything at the time. And that was like my moment to do the entrepreneurial thinking that I'd never had headspace to do. And it just became really obvious that I had all of this evidence in front of me that there was a need. And if I just kept serving the need, there might be something in it. And so instead of business plan B, that was just a blank piece of paper, I just followed my nose with the opportunities in front of me. And so it's been a complete roller coaster because there was never a plan. I never set out for this to be what it is today. And it's evolving all the time. I'll try and pinpoint like a few moments or learnings in that journey. So the first big springboard was basically furlough. So I was building this at a time where loads of my kind of early community were out of work and were on furlough. And what that meant is that I had the most incredible volunteer workforce for 6 months. So a generous handful of members got in touch and said, I'm bored out of my mind. Can I help? And I was like, I have no money. Just to be clear, I have no money. But if you help and if we get to X goal, I will create a job for you. But I don't currently have any money, but I promise you, if you make money, I'll give it to you. And that meant that I had a social strategy and a partnerships plan and events manager and all of this amazing support from a group of incredible women who just decided that I was more interesting than watching daytime TV. So I think there's a real lesson in that, in taking offers of kindness at face value, and so long as there's full transparency, like not looking a gift horse in the mouth and just demonstrating real gratitude, I think I could have handled those opportunities very differently, and that wouldn't have given me those opportunities, like given me that potential. And then as I began to bring team members into the business, like my first few hires, I think I really like gave us permission to daydream and to like really wonder what this could become. So Hope was my first employee, and we had an intern called Shubham, who was a young kid from Delhi. The three of us had this corkboard that was like leaned up against a wall in my flat, and it had Post-its on it, and that was our roadmap, and we would move the Post-its around with drawing pins. And on that corkboard was hosting a podcast, hosting a festival, retreats, stuff that we've now all done. Nothing on that corkboard 4 years later we haven't done. And actually very little that we have done wasn't on that corkboard. And I think it was so important that I allowed the team to to dream those things as possibilities, and to show them over and over again that we make magical things happen, and therefore we have the confidence to dream up the next big thing. The other thing that I've been very intentional about, it's kind of my third roller coaster lesson, is around financial transparency and like respecting your employees' basic needs. So COVID struck and we had 24 open roles for our recruitment business, which at that point was where we made all of our money. And in 24 hours, it went to 4. And then by 48 hours, it was at 0. And so I kind of watched all future revenue just go in 48 hours. And I looked at my personal bank account and I did the maths on how long I could pay me and the tiny team, which was not long, but I was like, okay, I can drain myself and we'll be okay for X amount of time. And I said to myself, well, that's what you're going to do. They come first. And in that moment, I made a commitment to myself that I would never put myself under that kind of pressure again. And I would never put the team in a position where they felt like they had to ask me whether it was going to be okay. And I fully appreciate that as a startup ethos, that's quite risk averse. And there are loads of founders who like live on the edge of payroll. But for me, it's felt very important that in order to ask for commitment and focus from my team, I need to give them real reassurance that they're going to be okay. And I have like a sort of zero tolerance approach to any concerns about job security. Like that should never be an isolated question. That always needs to be fully in the open, and they need full reassurance. And if I can't give them reassurance, they need full honesty. So there's 3: financial transparency as an ethos, taking acts of kindness at face value, and then allowing the team to dream.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on there that I think what you're talking about is so powerful. I really appreciate the fact that you had this sense of personal commitment to your team during the pandemic. I've been in lots of roles and I've lost lots of roles due to restructures and acquisitions. And, I found myself on the wrong side of redundancy quite a few times in my career. And my experience of that is people would say, oh, it's not personal, it's just business. But the impact is deeply, deeply personal for the people on the other side of those decisions. And so I think it's such a courageous move and such a heartfelt move for you to look at your personal circumstances and try and figure out, how can I help my team through this? Because this is going to have a dramatic personal impact on them. So I think that's just such a brave move, but also really interesting to see how that has gone on to impact the way you approach your businesses moving forward, and that structure of open conversations around professional security, having those conversations out in the open rather than hiding them away. And I love the fact that the start, or when Upworld really started to ramp up, was as a result that you built this great community. You had people who were willing to say, I volunteer, I want to join in, I want to do something good with my time. And that is only possible because you're building those authentic relationships and you're building that authentic sense of community. And so I would encourage anybody who is building anything, like, how can you introduce important community-based themes into what you're doing? Like, how can you build it on genuine, authentic relationships? What does it look like to really consider, what does community look like here? And how can I build around those principles?
So I agree with you. The catch is it's inherently uncommercial. So, and I get a lot of calls asking me to do like community building for hire. And I always say no, because I think it's a bit of an oxymoron. Community building is inherently, if you think about the history of time, communities have been built by like the church and the village hall. They are inherently non-commercial activities that are motivated by a sense of greater good. And there is definitely a tension when you try and monetize that thinking. I think it's really powerful. I actually think it's really powerful as a commercial tactic, but I think it's slow. So I spent years building a community for no more than like the cost of my dinners. And now we grow a community that breaks even just about. But my community, so Up Club has a load of paying members. That's not a commercial beast. It's a sort of delightfully terrible business model that I'm really proud of for all of its like weirdness.
There's something really important there, the word club.
Yeah.
I think there is a difference between building community and building clubs, right? You know, a club, you pay your subs, there can be a commercial structure to that. There are different parameters about what people can expect. And I actually think that whilst I encourage people to engage with the principles of building community and what that looks like, and maybe a great number of businesses could build slower. Yes, it isn't necessarily commercially viable, but ultimately it's relationships that will make the world go around and not money. So maybe we could all perhaps take a second look at what we really want to get done on planet Earth. Like, is it just to make as much money as possible, or is it to do something good? Maybe they don't go hand in hand, and that is okay. Maybe we could build some other things. But actually, maybe rather than trying to commercialize community, think about what does a club structure look like, where I can be more transparent about my pricing and my commercial objectives and not co-opt the language of community, which I think is being, well, from what I see on my LinkedIn feed, is being gradually cheapened because it's trending. Like, community is trending. It's like, that kind of makes me feel really uncomfortable. Let's separate when we mean club and be okay with that, and be okay with the commercial objectives of that. And when we mean community, which might be a bit slower, which might be a bit more authentic, but ultimately might be really, really valuable. So I would actually challenge ourselves more broadly to think, am I building a community really, or am I building a club? And actually, maybe I should make my peace with the club option and just be authentic about that. But we could probably spend a whole load of time really diving into just this.
Rabbit hole, and I can go straight down there if you want me to.
No, I'm really enjoying it. But let me come back to why I reached out to you in the first place. Because as I said, I've been observing Upworld for a while, and I've been familiar with your name, I guess, as a personality in the LinkedIn, in the startup marketing space.
Yeah.
But there was this one post that you created, which has gone really very, very viral. The last time I checked, you're up to nearly 7,000 likes. I think you said to me before this call, something like 700,000 impressions, 700 comments. And you were just opening up about the fact that the world wants to have coffee again, and how your organizations are moving away from remote working into roaming working, which I thought was a lovely turn of phrase. And increasing the expectation that there's going to be more real world human to human contact. And that just struck a chord with people. I mean, it's gone everywhere. And what I loved about it, what I really appreciated about it, is it was a signal to me about the way that you're building your policies, the way you're approaching organizational culture. Because that kind of pivot, that kind of change, when you say, oh, by the way, guys, we're not just going to be remote anymore, there's going to be an expectation that you now come into the office a bit more, or we now have more face-to-face time in the real world. Like, that is a big change in the way people work. And it's only possible if you have the right community principles in place, or the right kind of relationships, that your team are on the journey with you. There's a sense of shared ownership. When you have that kind of cultural setting, you can make those policy changes. And so often for businesses, their policies become stagnant and brittle, and they become hard to change because people aren't really on the journey with you. So tell us a little bit about that decision and why it worked for your business.
Well, I'd say that post going viral is one of the weirdest, most hilarious experiences of my life. In itself, it actually describes a quite subtle shift in internal culture. So, old world, we're fully remote. We expect our team to be in the UK twice a year for a compulsory summer party and a compulsory winter party. That's it. The rest of the time, you can be wherever you want. There's a few company calls you have to be online for. Otherwise, do what you want. New world, we still have no office. We never will for now. Who knows? Everything might change. No office, no contractual requirement to be anywhere for a certain number of days, but a expectation that we might ask you to come to meetings more often. And that will be different per role in the business. And then we'll have specific conversations on an individual basis to outline roughly how much that might look like. In a world where most businesses are mandating like 3 days a week return to the office, this is very chill. So I was genuinely like taken aback, to say the least, by the incredibly vitriolic debate on Reddit, of which I've only read a tiny bit because my partner and my chief of staff has like banned me from going near it. They're like, you are not allowed to read that. It's horrendous. But I was trending #1 globally on Reddit for 48 hours. Like the top of Reddit in the whole world was me for 48 hours. With this mad discussion about my micromanaging behavior and how I was enforcing a culture on my team, which is total nonsense. So I'm enforcing that maybe we have a conversation about sometimes coming to a meeting. If that is draconian management, then like, I honestly think we've lost the plot. That is having a constructive conversation with my team that says, look, we're all realizing that more and more people are asking you to come in for a workshop or to spend some time together. And you're also really prioritizing your personal development. And I know you want to get promoted and I know you want to be working on more exciting, interesting stuff. And my hunch is that you need to be able to say yes to those invites to workshops a bit more often. And so that's in your interest and in my interest. So let's think about accepting that and think about how we might hire and plan in the future to make that more possible. We are incredibly supportive. So we cover, it's role by role, but we cover a huge amount of expenses for travel. We still hire all over the UK. We have 4 employees who live outside of the UK. We probably won't hire anyone else who doesn't live in the country. But anyone in the business can spend extensive chunks of time working abroad, and that's totally fine, so long as they just manage it around their diaries and their other responsibilities. So it is a very chill change in policy. The reason I wrote that post was because one of my leadership team, it was so funny. One of my leadership team was like, I'm just doing all these interviews and loads of people are applying for jobs with us who live in like Bali and Lisbon because we're quite famous in our little bubble for remote work. And now that we don't do that anymore, could you just write something so that I can just link it to them to say we've actually changed the way we think about stuff? So that post was honestly intended as like a piece of HR admin. It was like, oh, just do a favor for one of my team. That HR admin drove like the biggest spike in traffic we've ever seen, drove some like pretty horrendous people emailing the business to like tell us apropos of nothing their thoughts on me as like a dickhead manager. Like, cool, thanks for sharing that. What am I meant to do with that? And created this like really wonderful conversation on LinkedIn where loads of people were really supportive. So very weird experience. Behind the scenes of that, you're right, was a like quite open, quite protracted, quite complex set of discussions across the business with individuals and with the business as a whole to sort of help us get ready for that change in approach. So for some of my team who live abroad and are building lives abroad, they've got tons of questions around like, what does that mean for my personal development? Like, am I going to get left behind? Does that mean that I don't have a role in the company in the future? Does that mean that you're going to replace me for someone who's UK based? And those are difficult discussions because I have huge loyalty to them. I also have a real awareness that they, in some cases, would be better at their jobs if they were London based. And I have to find like literally individual by individual, we have to manage how that dynamic works. And that's what we've done. We've had a ton of individual conversations and we will continue to do so. And it'll all be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. We review our policies proactively and often. So every 2 months, we do an internal pulse survey, which is like a big old form where the team can share anything and everything. And we have a very open feedback culture throughout. Our handbook is a Notion board, which is publicly accessible, so anyone can read our handbook, and it's linked in all job ads. So I feel really strongly that someone should know everything about your internal policy before they apply for a role with you. I think it's wild that you accept the job and then they're like, oh, by the way, our mat leave is terrible. Sorry. It's like, you shouldn't have to ask that question before, you should know that way before you bother to send someone your CV. Like that should be upfront. So all of that exists. And we issue policy updates really frequently. So every couple of months, we'll say like, we've made a change to this policy and we'll log, like there's a page in the handbook, which is like all of the changes logged to the policies. So this was just another one of those examples. So like, yes, it was wild response to what is actually quite a small change, given that, as I said, most people are like mandating return to office and far more kind of strict and unflexible than what we're suggesting, which is still like inherently so flexible. And it's definitely been the product of an open culture where I think everyone in the business knows. I genuinely believe this. I think everyone in my business knows that I'm really trying to consider that I'm always balancing what's best for them, what's best for the wider team, and what's best for the business. And those three things are not always, like, they don't always neatly align. And that's really difficult. But my job is to try and find a way through those tensions.
I think that dialogue of those tensions is so critical. And when people who work for you, who are delivering for you, can understand and see that is the dialogue that's taking place, I think that's when they feel they can go with you and they can say, I understand that decision might not be the one that I wanted most, or it might not be the one that gives me personally the greatest benefit, but I'm building this thing. I'm a part of this story. I have ownership in what we're doing together, and I can buy into the togetherness of this decision. And I think that's certainly what I took away from that post.
Yeah.
Like I said, was the symbol that we've changed the thing and we can change the thing because we're on a journey together. And there's that shared sense of ownership. There's that shared sense of, I have a stake in this thing. And I think it's so bizarre, right? I was going to say funny, but it's definitely not funny. It's just so weird that I can read that post one way and go, oh, what a great thing. What a great symbol of culture. And I go into the handbook and I read the handbook and I'm like, this is amazing. This is so transparent. Like, people need this. And you've got this other subset of people who are like, well, isn't this just hell on earth? How can
that's
people...
just like, I'm trying to be compassionate and see both sides of the story, but the alternative perspective is just so factually inaccurate. Like, there's now an article, this is peak, there's an article that someone's written about the Reddit thread, about the LinkedIn post, which has a whole paragraph on how unacceptable it is that I've mandated return to the office. no one's fact checked whether we have an office because the business is registered to my mum's house. So like that's going to run out of steam quite quickly. And no one's thought to ask me, like, just send me a message and ask me what my views are on this mandated return to the made up office. So I just think, like, get your facts right if you're going to have a go at someone.
Well, that's it. And look, guys, reach out to Lottie because
Yeah.
she may say yes and come on your podcast. You know, that's how this works.
I'm super open. Like this whole thing is about being really open to conversations and feedback. So it's absolutely not that I don't want to hear the hard stuff. I think this is actually, this maybe is like a kind of theme to really dig into, because the reason that I throw myself into podcasts and are open to Reddit conversations and have built this culture is that I'm obsessed with the power of feedback. And by making that central to the way I've built the business, I've been able to make all these cultural shifts and to change all these policies and bring the team along the journey. Because one, I've asked for loads of feedback, so I know that nothing's going to come as a surprise. And two, they really readily give feedback and they give the hard feedback. And I think that's like, if that wasn't in place, none of the cultural change stuff would be possible. So there's this like, it's a to me, that's the most important thing I've done. And that's the thing that I want to implore other business owners to really prioritize, is creating a culture, a healthy feedback culture.
So you're right. We've got a couple of other stops on our journey that we want to hit in the space of today's episode. And we are going to talk shortly about a challenge that you think, a cultural challenge that you see facing leaders or organizations today, and the kind of action they can take to do something about that. So let's take a step back and look across the spectrum for a second, because I know that you've been thinking about organizational culture and your culture crush, which might be a person or an organization that you admire within this space. Could you just tell us who that is and why?
I thought it was a really fun question. I had my dominant thought was none, because my whole reason for being a business builder is a rebellion from culture I've really not enjoyed as an employee. So like my big feeling was, if there was a culture that I admired, I would have gone to work for them, and that would have been a lot less hassle than doing this whole thing myself. There are a few, like there's two references that I've taken that I think I really draw upon. So one is the way Netflix talk about transparency of sharing data and information. I actually have no idea if this is true. If anyone works for Netflix and is listening to this, please do reach out and tell me whether this actually happens or not. In the Netflix book, it talks about how you have to hire very good people and you have to pay them very well, which I try, but I can't necessarily afford. And then you have to give them all of the transparency and information so that they have the tools to be able to make the best possible decisions. And if you don't share openly, then they are blindfolded, and how can you expect good people to do good work if they don't know what's going on? I really took that to heart, and I have led at times like overboard in that way. Like at times I've definitely shared with very junior members of the team stuff that they like, frankly, are like, I don't need to know this. And it's really confusing me and actually stressing me out. So I've definitely gone too far. But on the whole, I think I've really bought into this ethos of this ethos of openness and making access to data, like democratizing access to data so that anyone has the ability to make high level decisions. And then the second is very different. There's a business called Pip Nut that makes peanut butter, and it's run by a woman called Pip. Again, I've never worked for Pip. I've done some projects for her, but I don't know what she's like as a boss. But she struck me from our very early conversations, and I've spent a fair bit of time with her over the years. She struck me as someone who was really trying to do leadership right as her. And that meant being the kind of boss who will go to your wedding, being the kind of boss who you can like WhatsApp on a Saturday if you found something funny, but also being the kind of boss who you know will really get the best out of you. And I've got a bit of a crush on how she's managed to do that. So those are the two references that I use kind of on a weekly basis. I'd like draw upon how would those two frameworks handle this situation.
Do you know what? It would be really, really interesting, right? If, well, Pip Murray, you've had a shout out. Perhaps it would be lovely to get you on the show
Yeah.
and talk about this. But the Netflix question, so we can get to Pip, right? We know Pip. Well, you know Pip. But the Netflix question, it would be really interesting if somebody from Netflix hears this and wants to come and talk about that little piece of policy. We want to know whether it's true or not. And if you reach out to me, I'll reach out to Lottie, and maybe we can jump on another episode and talk about it together. That would be very, very cool. I thought it was really funny when you said at the top of that section, no one, right? I was thinking that might not have been great for the show, but it does make a really, really good point, because you and I were talking before we hit record about the fact that when I talk about my culture crushes, it's not always about putting a company on a pedestal and saying, this is a perfect company with a perfect culture. But I think it's really important for anybody, as we're looking at companies that we admire, or we like that, or that was really cool. Like, you're not endorsing the whole thing, but actually, what are the signals that you can see that you think, oh, that would be good in my world, or that would be a good policy for me to implement?
Yeah.
Like, culture crush doesn't mean that we're endorsing everything or saying that we've got a perfect supply chain or saying everything's great. What we are, though, doing is recognizing that there are things that we can take away and try, which brings us neatly on to our final section of the show. So I know that you've been thinking about, I think we touched on it already, but a cultural challenge or a leadership challenge that you are aware of. So why don't you take us through that in a little more detail, but just bounce straight into what you think the solution is, or what's the practical thing that our listeners can do to respond to the challenge that you're highlighting?
I think that lack of feedback culture, definitely in British society, but maybe in Western society and maybe in global society, is the fundamental problem that creates so many of the other kind of cultural toxicities. So we were chatting before this about businesses struggling to build effective remote cultures, and that's an example of what goes really wrong when your feedback culture isn't strong. So that I think is like the biggest problem that I see, and the problem that, if I can like impart one bit of wisdom to other leaders, it's to like think about that and take that seriously. So good feedback culture is a world where your team feel confident and comfortable sharing suggestions, criticism, emotional reflection, and ideas with the team, like with their leadership team, but also where a team can self-coach effectively, because individuals are able to give each other peer level feedback on where they think people have done things either particularly well or where they see opportunities to improve in each other. So when it works well, it is a live stream of insight as to how you can make your business operate better. And it is a personal development plan on steroids, because you have everyone in the business supporting each other effectively all the time. When it goes badly, you have a real breakdown in communication. You have emotion that gets stored up within levels of a hierarchy. So you'll have, a pocket of disgruntled execs because they have nowhere to take those feelings and no idea on how to process that stuff, and therefore it sits and festers. You also have no development outside of direct line management and outside of like a formalized 6-monthly review process. It's reliant on one person to spend one meeting telling you whether you're doing a good or bad job, as opposed to like a consistent culture of incremental improvements. So there's so much benefit in getting it right, and there's quite a lot to be lost from getting it wrong. And yet British society is like inherently anti good feedback culture. Like our whole thing is just to kind of get on with it. And politeness means that we think it's kind to not tell someone something that they might not want to hear. When the reality is, it is so much more kind to say the honest thing and to give it that thought as to how you can like package up that honest feedback in a way that someone might be able to like really hear and respond to. So I think culturally we've got it a bit wrong, and that is reflected in business culture that creates a whole load of problems. So it was very important to me from day one that we had a really good feedback culture. And like, if that's kind of my insight, how I've thought about handling that, is through a whole pile of cultural intervention. So there's actually a lot of things we do in the fabric of our business. I think there's two that are worth mentioning. So the first is, on the first day, every new starter gets sent a copy of Radical Candor and a document which is my view on how Radical Candor lives and breathes in our business. That's then followed up by a call with me where I emphasize that my door is always open and talk about how hierarchy doesn't mean that I'm not always available, and really emphasize that point. So the onboarding process puts feedback in the heart of the way we do business. And then the second thing that I think is really important and kind of replicable is a focus on speedback, which is like a bit of a lame term, but it's actually a really useful muscle reflex. So we put a lot of effort into giving each other feedback as opposed to waiting for moments to give feedback and labeling it as such, and asking permission. So I had this 8 p.m. last night. I sat down to dinner and I had a Slack from one of my team saying, hey, are you in the mood for some quick feedback? And two things in that. One, he's labelled, this is him giving me something really fast, which is how I want to receive it. And the second is that he's given me the opportunity to say, you know what, mate, I'm absolutely knackered. Can I have it in the morning? He's giving me permission to do that. And that's we've really taught that as a behaviour, to ask permission for those things. And by doing that, you give someone the opportunity to make sure that they're in the right frame of mind for it. You give them the opportunity to share some notes on how they'd like to receive it. So someone might say yeah, I am, but could I have it in writing because that's the way I prefer to process stuff? Or, yeah, I am, let me call you at lunch. Or, yep, but let's, I'm having a drink with you on Thursday, so let's cover it then. You give the individual the ability to control that. But I think by codifying that, speed and the focus on asking for permission, we've created a really, really a really uniquely healthy culture around feedback, which is what's allowed me to do cultural change quite confidently.
So, Lottie, we're coming into land, which we're pleased to hear. But there's a couple of really interesting things that I just wanted to pick up or add a little bit of a nuance to. The first is that this format and this approach to open communication, I think, goes all the way back to when you were first starting out with your supper club, dealing with that sense of isolation, separation, loneliness. And I can see how that really powerful thread of let's stay in dialogue, let's stay connected, we don't need to go it alone, is still showing up today in how you're approaching things like feedback and speedback. And I also really, really love the term speedback. I think that's a great way of framing it. And I love the idea that you're not, what has happened to me so many times, right, is when I've been waiting for an appraisal or waiting for 360 feedback, and you think everything's going really, really well. And then all of a sudden you've got part of that wave is what you could do better. And you're I just didn't think about it from that perspective. Even if it's valid feedback, it's still delivered in a way that is a bit clunky and a bit painful. Whereas I think this builds your resilience as a team because you're opening the door to regular feedback that occasionally might give you a little friction burn. It might be I'm not sure I was ready for that. But if you practice that as a group and as a team, you build your resilience to feedback. And then when there is perhaps more extended feedback or something like that, you're more ready for it. You're kind of this is what we do here. We make each other better. We challenge each other. So I love that. Now, as I said, we're coming into land and we've covered a lot of ground. And honestly, it's been such a wonderful conversation. But I wonder, is there, and you may have already covered this, but is there a top takeaway or one thing that you want our listeners to go away and try as soon as the episode finishes?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Other than read Radical Candor, which everyone should do, I think the most actionable thing is to practice a bit of vulnerability. And I think that's today's basically just being a peeling of the onion of all of my life views on culture. So we sort of started with how I think about remote working, and then policy, and then feedback. And actually kind of one back from feedback is showing up vulnerably. And this is a very personal value, which is how I show up in the workplace and also how I show up in the pub, which is that if I'm not okay, I'm going to tell you I'm not okay. And if I'm great, I'm going to tell you I'm really great. And I'm going to tell you why. And I think that that's sort of like the most actionable thing that I can ask of anyone. Like, press exit on this podcast, and the next conversation you have, overshare that one step. Push yourself to go a bit further than what feels comfortable in how much you decide to disclose to that individual. And why I ask that you do that is that that's where I think real human connection begins to form, like genuine, not British, like actual connection. And I also think that by role modeling that kind of behavior, you motivate someone to do the same back for you. And that's where you can start being really empathetic, and that's where you can really start to listen. So if we just say like, I'm fine, how are you? Unsurprisingly, the answer to that question is not going to be truthful. So what happens if you answer that question truthfully? And then how does that conversation play out?
That's a really, really interesting and challenging place, I think, for people to go when they stop listening. And I would, anyone who makes that move, I'll make sure that I link in the show notes my profile on LinkedIn and Lottie's profile on LinkedIn.
Yeah, please.
Because if you actually take that step, we'd love to know how that went or what shifted in those relationships. Like, give us some feedback, talk back to us about how you've applied some of the lessons from this episode. But Lottie, as I said, we're coming into land. Well, we are landing. We are on the tarmac. And I just want to say thank you so much for making some time for Culture Crush.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And I really mean, like what Dan said, I really mean that. Like, anyone, please reach out. If anything in this has felt interesting or worthy of more conversation, then I'd love to hear thoughts and keep the chat going.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please do your thing and like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a culture first leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.